It's no secret that I love video games, but on their own, there's not that much that you can do with them. Like, what are you gonna do, just stare at them? Don't get me wrong, I like staring at video games, but that's not all that they were made for. Their main purpose is to be played on a TV. But you don't just go from this to this with magic. You need a device to do so. A machine that is capable of taking a game, reading it, and outputting a video signal on TV based on what it reads. You need a game console. Ever since the Magnavox Odyssey released in 1972, home video game consoles have been a staple in people's households, with each new generation bringing new and improved hardware with it. And 52 years later, we end up here. With the 10th generation of video game consoles just barely on the horizon, I can't help but think about how far we've come. I mean, in only 50 years we went from Pong, which was top of the line when it first came out, to swinging around in New York City as Spider-Man. That's not a long time if you think about it. And throughout the years, consoles really have changed a lot. I'm sure that if Ralph Baer, creator of the Magnavox Odyssey, time traveled from 1972 to now, he would gawk at what gaming has become. Because during the first generation, consoles were a lot simpler. They were machines that were only capable of playing games that were built into them, lots of them just being Pong consoles. It wasn't until the second generation that consoles would start to use interchangeable cartridges, the first to do so being the Fairchild Channel F. I still get a kick out of this knob on a stick controller that it had. And of course, there was the Atari 2600, releasing a year later in 1977, and gets way more love and attention than the Channel F because of the fact that it, existed. This console pretty much defined the second generation, but where there is success, there are copycats. And this overflow of copycats creating poor quality, unoriginal games would lead to the video game crash of 1983, which would be the biggest crash in video game history. While the crash destroyed video gaming in America, it gave the opportunity for new companies to take over, starting in a little obscure country known as Japan. In Japan, a new company, at the time, called Nintendo would release their new console, the Famicom, in 1983, a sort of spiritual successor to their first console, the color TV game. They quickly established dominance with their strong first-party lineup and a revolutionary new controller which used a control scheme that included a D-pad. Wow! I know, nuts, right? A button layout now overshadowed by the superior analog stick was once a revolution in gaming. With the Famicom being a success, the next logical step was to bring it to the States. But the crash in America left a deep distaste for video games as a whole. So, Nintendo had to get clever. They changed the kiddie top-loading design of the Famicom to a more boxy, front-loading look which resembled the style of VHS players at the time. They also renamed it the Nintendo Entertainment System to make it seem like less of a game system and more like a professional entertainment device. With these clever tactics, the console was a success. Thus, a legend was born, third generation defined, US game market revitalized, and the NES is still a cultural icon to this very day. So, what do you do next after you create something that's a massive success? Improve on it, of course. The fourth generation was dominated by the Super NES and the Sega Genesis. Sega made consoles before, but this time they would go into an all-out war with Nintendo. This generation may have seen the fiercest competition ever, with both companies just fighting each other for more recognition. Just look at some Sega Genesis commercials on the internet and you'll see what I mean.
What Nintendo?
Well, technically, it should actually be what Nintendo doesn't because it's in the third person and it's singular. Be quiet! Honestly, I wish they still made commercials like this. They're less informative, but they're entertaining. There's just less pizzazz with these newer promotional videos where all we do is just look at close-up views of a CGI console from different angles. Come on, man, this is so boring. But despite the fierce competition from Sega, Nintendo still won. Obviously, because they're better. When the fifth generation rolled around, consoles made their big leap into 3D, and another competitor would soon join the console war. In 1994, Sony released the first PlayStation, the product of a broken deal between them and Nintendo to create a CD hybrid Super NES console which was going to be called, get this, the Nintendo PlayStation. I know, it hurts my brain to think about that too. The Sony PlayStation sold way better than the Nintendo 64 and Sega Saturn combined, selling just over 100 million units in its lifetime, more than the competition wished they could. The PS1 used CDs instead of the traditional cartridges, and while the use of CDs made loading times go from virtually non-existent to existent, they made up for it with the fact that they could hold more information. So, Nintendo looked at that and said, yeah, I can do that. So their next-gen console, the GameCube, would use mini discs instead of regular ones. I mean, honestly, what did you expect? It's Nintendo. The reason that the GameCube used mini discs was because of piracy concerns, which is a real shame, because certain games that were too big to be put on a mini disc either had to be put on two of them, no, I'm not making that up, or they were just not brought to the GameCube altogether, which I'm sure affected the console's sales. Another thing that affected the GameCube's sales was its solidifying reputation of being a console made for kids, and not for the mature and hardcore gamer like the PS2 was. People even relate this console to a lunchbox because of the handle on its back. That should give you an idea of how people viewed this thing. Oh yeah, and Microsoft got in on the action too. In 2001, Microsoft released the first Xbox, named after the DirectX graphics API they used to compete with the PS2 and the GameCube. Microsoft, being familiar with computer hardware, made the Xbox by taking computer parts, stuffing them into a console shell, and calling it a day. I know this is essentially what all game consoles are, but Microsoft took the most literal approach with this. It literally ran on Windows, albeit a heavily modified version. The PS2 absolutely dominated this generation and became the best-selling console of all time, selling roughly 157 million units in its lifetime. You see, the reason it did so well was because of the fact that it could play DVDs as well as games, and was a lot cheaper than standard DVD players at the time, because, you know, new technology is always expensive. So not only was it a game machine, it was a movie machine too. So why wouldn't you buy it? The Sega Dreamcast was Sega's worst selling console by far, selling a whopping 9.13 million units. Needless to say, it was a commercial failure and would be Sega's last game console, thus establishing the three gaming giants of the modern era: Nintendo, PlayStation, and Xbox. The 7th generation made the big leap into HD. It brought the PS3 from Sony and the Xbox 360 from Microsoft. But when it came time for Nintendo to release their next console, they took a different approach. Every previous Nintendo console sold increasingly worse as time went on. They realized that competing directly with the competition wasn't paying off. So, instead of competing directly and focusing on raw power and specs, they decided to appeal to a more casual audience. You know, the people who don't consider themselves gamers but play video games sometimes? Yeah, make a console for them. It wasn't even HD, but it paid off, I'll tell you that. The Wii ended up selling 101 million units and outsold the PS3 and Xbox 360 by a pretty good margin. Once again, Nintendo had become king. Their reign wouldn't last long though, and their next console would end up being one of their biggest failures. The Wii U was Nintendo's next-gen console, releasing in 2012 with this bulky, wacky controller tablet thing. If the Wii was a success, certainly this console would too. The Wii U was a product of a pretty good idea with bad execution. The controller it comes with, the gamepad, adds an interesting level of depth with its touchscreen. It could even be used as a second screen in certain games, and most games could be played on the gamepad without the need for a TV. But the battery life is terrible. A full charge will only last you about 3 to 5 hours. In comparison, the Wii U Pro controller can last up to 80 hours, and while it's able to be played without a TV using the gamepad, it needs a stable connection to the console at all times in order for it to function, and cannot be used individually. If the GameCube was the purple lunchbox, the Wii U gamepad is the handicapped tablet. These drawbacks and a poor marketing strategy ultimately led to the Wii U's demise, At the end of its lifespan, it only ended up selling a pathetic 13 million units. But these commercials, man, only an 8-year-old would actually want to buy a Wii U after seeing one of these.
Hot buttered popcorn, that's it!
And these ads were so heavily focused around the new controller, no wonder people were misled into thinking that's all it was, just some sort of accessory for the Wii. It even misled me. Before I was this video game nerd who posted videos on YouTube, I knew next to nothing about video games outside of the Switch. At one point, I thought the Wii and the Wii U were the same thing. If it wasn't for a fortunate chain of events that led me to the discovery of the Wii U, I might not have even become a game collector. So, yeah, I guess I owe game collecting to the Wii U, and I actually do like the console and wish it would have sold more. But enough about the Wii U. There were, of course, consoles from Sony and Microsoft during this generation too. The Xbox One was kind of weird, like, why was it called the Xbox One? It's the third Xbox. And even if it was the first Xbox, you have to be really confident to put 1 in the name of something. But aside from the name, to even play it, you have to be connected to the internet, and you can only play brand new games on it. I honestly don't know what Microsoft was thinking when doing this. Sony even made a video making fun of the Xbox One's inability to play used games.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
Hilarious. Speaking of Sony, they were the only ones not messing up in this generation. The new console was the PS4, very self-explanatory and not at all misleading, and you can even play used games. Wow, Microsoft, that's embarrassing. I shouldn't even have to be pointing this out. Anyways, Sony won this generation, selling 117 million PS4s in its lifetime. Which brings us to today, the 9th generation, and what a time to be alive. In 2020, Microsoft released the Xbox Series X and Series S, and Sony released the PlayStation 5. The PS5 is Sony's newest console and the fastest console to ever hit the market. Loading times are lightning fast to where they feel pretty much non-existent. The best example of this has to be Marvel's Spider-Man 2's fast travel, where, I kid you not, it takes literally 2 seconds or less to travel from one end of New York City to the other. Sony really went above and beyond with the design of this console and made it look like some sort of futuristic spaceship. The Series X and S, on the other hand, went with very minimalist designs. Really, the Series S just looks like some sort of glorified speaker and the Series X just looks like a mini fridge. I'm not completely sure why Microsoft decided to release 2 consoles at the same time, but I do think I know why for the most part. And my ideas are really not that far-fetched. They probably released the 2 different consoles to appeal to different audiences, the Series S being for the more casual gamer. It's smaller, cheaper, and digital only, and could easily be used as a main media hub for your streaming services, in case, you know, you don't want to use a game console for playing games. The Series X is black, which makes it look professional. It's big, which makes it look more professional. It's heavy, which makes it feel professional. I think you get what I'm trying to say. The Series X was made for the hardcore gamer. It's the most powerful console to ever exist, but those consoles pale in comparison to Nintendo's 9th gen console. Released 3 years prior, the Nintendo Switch became Nintendo's best-selling home console of all time, and the 3rd best-selling console to ever exist, selling 143 million units and counting. In my opinion, the Switch was a great idea right from the start. It breathed new life into what the Wii U tried to achieve. I like to say that if the Wii and the Wii U had a baby, it would be the Switch. It's a weird image, I know, but it makes sense. The Switch has motion controls, just like the Wii, and can be played without a TV, like the Wii U, but is truly able to be used on the go. It takes the best from both worlds and improves them in almost every way. I mean, just look at the Switch in handheld mode next to the gamepad. You can clearly see the resemblance. I've always liked that Nintendo has the guts to try new things, adding twists to tried and true formats or just doing gimmicky things. Sometimes it fails, and sometimes it pays off. But it's what makes Nintendo, Nintendo, and that's why I like them best. I feel like Xbox and PlayStation's Red Ocean strategy gets pretty boring and repetitive. It's like they just make the same thing over and over again but with a fresh coat of paint. But hey, clearly lots of people don't mind. After all, PlayStation has been consistently successful with every home console released, while in comparison, Xbox sales have been consistently mid, some selling better than others, and of course, Nintendo had their ups and their downs. We've come very far with video game consoles. Like I said before, it's crazy to think about how far we've come from Pong consoles and polygonal 3D models to games like this. But I didn't mention every console in this video. There were lots of insignificant nobodies trying to make it big in every single console generation, most of them doing But until the Switch 2 finally releases and the PS6 and whatever the heck Microsoft's next console is going to be called, we have all of this, and you really can't complain. Alright, that wraps up a casual history of home video game consoles. And if you want to see more video game history like this, let me know by leaving a like. Alright, that's it for me. Never forget that Jesus loves you, and see you later.